Okay, so these are for my biology students. This is chapter 9 about cellular respiration. So when I say cell, you should know what that means, right? The basic unit of life. And then respiration, you might think of breathing, right? In and air, inhaling and exhaling out. But this is a different kind of respiration. Specifically, we're talking about the cells here. So let me read this to you here. And this is from your Pearson biology book here. Think about it. When you are hungry, how do you feel? If you are like most people, you might feel sluggish, a little dizzy, and above all, weak. Weakness is a feeling triggered by a lack of energy. You feel weak when you are hungry because food serves as a source of energy. Weakness is your body's way of telling you that your energy supplies are low. But how does food get converted into a usable form of energy? Car engines have to burn gasoline in order to release its energy. Do our bodies burn food the way a car burns gasoline? Or is there something more to it? So, food provides us with the things that we need, the chemical building blocks to grow and reproduce, like these Skittles. Recall that some organisms, such as plants, are autotrophs, meaning they make their own food through the process of photosynthesis. Other organisms are heterotrophs. They cannot make their own food. They rely on other organisms for food. For all organisms, food molecules contain chemical energy that is released when those bonds break. So, how do organisms get energy? Like heterotrophs? From eating, okay? From food. How much energy is actually present in food? You might have heard the word calorie before. A calorie is the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degrees Celsius. So it's a unit of measure. You see the amount of calories listed on food, and it has a very specific definition. The amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. The amount of calories can change depending on the food. How our cells metabolize food, or this glucose that we're taking in, right? The Skittles, simple sugars, to produce ATP is what cellular respiration means. It's the ways that our cells do this. Take that glucose that we consume and convert it into a usable form of energy known as ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So, for example, carbohydrates and proteins, carbohydrates like glucose, for every gram of glucose, it has I should change this to a capital C, four calories. Lipids actually have 9 calories per gram. All right, we know that cellular respiration is this process, okay? So cells, of course, don't simply burn food and release energy as heat, okay? We need to break down the food molecules and gradually capturing a little bit of chemical energy, ATP, at key steps. This enables our cells to use energy stored in those bonds of food, those chemical bonds, like glucose, to produce this ATP. And this ATP directly powers the activities of the cell. So cellular respiration happens in both animal cells and plant cells. Okay, so the plants that photosynthesize to make the glucose actually use the glucose themselves as well. Most of the ATP that we're going to talk about, that it is produced in a specific part of a cell called the mitochondria, or the powerhouse of the cell. It's called the powerhouse because it produces the ATP. Here's the cellular respiration equation. That chemical energy, of course, we know it's in the form of glucose. We're taking that in, converts it into a form that the body can use called ATP. And this happens in heterotrophs and autotrophs, so animals essentially and plants. And the equation that you'll have to know is exactly the opposite of the photosynthesis equation, except for a few minor details. This is an image from your book that shows how the light it goes into the plants, um, and also the other reactants, water, 6 molecules of water, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, to produce the products of photosynthesis, C6H12O6, glucose, plus 6 molecules of oxygen, okay, and this is a rabbit, and he's performing cellular respiration. They need that oxygen and glucose, as you can see here, and they produce water, carbon dioxide, and ATP. So the cellular respiration equation, which you're going to have to memorize as well, both in molecular formula and the words. We, of course, know that this is glucose. Okay. The O2 would be oxygen gas. And the 6 in front of it right here just means you need 6 molecules of oxygen. Over here, we only need 1 molecule of glucose because it's just implied that there's a 1 in front of it. Okay. Over here, the energy that it produces is called ATP. And we also produce 6 molecules of CO2, which is carbon dioxide gas, and then 6 molecules of water. All right, and that equation is balanced. Notice that it's the exact opposite of photosynthesis, except the energy form is different. Instead of light over here as a reactant, it's ATP as a product over here. All right, continuing on. So we're talking about cellular respiration. It can be split into 2 different types, aerobic and anaerobic respiration. You might have heard the word aerobic before. In this, we're talking specifically in cells of living things. The aerobic reactions that happen in cellular respiration require oxygen. Okay. Some examples specifically in cellular respiration. Okay, or does not. I guess we can fill that in right now. There we go. Some examples of the Krebs cycle, and this might not mean anything to you right now, and the electron chain. If we're just talking a physical activity, examples of aerobic activities are running, long distance, and then swimming, just to name a few. Okay. These activities require mass amounts of oxygen. Anaerobic activities, they do not require oxygen for those activities to happen, for those reactions to happen. An example specifically to cellular respiration is a reaction called glycolysis. And in our bodies or activities that you can actually do, weightlifting is an example on short distance sprints. Okay, short little bursts of energy. Moving on. Here is an example of how your cells extract the energy from glucose. Okay, so I'm taking this glucose, this wonderful red Skittle. I'm not going to eat it this time. Okay, how does my body actually convert that up here to ATP? All right, come on, lights. All right, so this outer box here, I just put that in. That represents the actual cell membrane, okay, of any cell in your body, okay? So these reactions are taking place within a cell. The first reaction is called glycolysis, and it takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. And what happens during glycolysis, here's a molecule of glucose. You can draw in little C's right here. Oop, I can't draw, but each one of those little orange dots represents 1 carbon. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because there's 6 carbons in 1 molecule of glucose. This reaction is anaerobic, so it does not require oxygen. Okay, Glucose, so what happens in glycolysis? Glucose is split up into two different molecules called pyruvic acids. There's one pyruvic acid, there's another pyruvic acid. Now this step, converting one molecule of glucose into two molecules of pyruvic acids, produces some energy, some ATP. It actually produces 2 net ATP. Now I say net because that's overall. There are some input of ATP required and some output. It needs some ATP, it produces more, but the total net gain is 2 ATP. Okay? The next reaction that happens to produce ATP, it's called the Krebs cycle. Another name for it is a citric acid cycle. And notice that I put the number 2 inside this oval shape right here. This is the mitochondria. Okay? So this reaction takes place in the mitochondria actually itself, which are in the cell. Any reaction that takes place in the mitochondria is aerobic, so it requires oxygen. Write that down, requires oxygen. So back to the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. The pyruvic acids produced up here are needed to start this chemical reaction, and it's actually a cycle. If you want to draw, I don't know why I can't draw, maybe a pen. Would like to draw, but it's not working. Like the little recycle symbol, how one product or something, I'm looking for paper here. Okay, like this. It's a cycle. Okay, so pyruvic acids are needed to produce something else, used to produce something else, used to produce something else, and it will just cycle through like that. And of course, that something else has specific names at every step, but you don't need to know that. So the net gain of ATP in that chemical reaction is also 2 ATP. Okay, and you should also note, add this part right here. A waste product, or essentially another product produced from the citric acid cycle. Okay, don't let that word waste just like confuse you. It just means something else that's produced besides the ATP as a result of the Krebs cycle is CO2. I'll just write carbon dioxide, okay, gas. All right, after the Krebs cycle, the products of that then move to the electron transport chain. It's called the electron transport chain because it's a stepladder, essentially a chain of events that transport, guess what? Electrons, okay? One of the things, let's see if this works now, that's needed, of course, is oxygen. So oxygen is put in here. And another waste product, you're going to want to add this. Waste product produced down here, essentially another product as a result of the electron transport chain, is water. Okay, and write down over here hydrogen ions. What will happen is hydrogen ions, which are essentially electrons, they get transported down this chain, passed along, and ADP, adenosine diphosphate, is converted to ATP. Electron transport chain cranks out a bunch of ATP molecules, 32 in fact, okay, including water. So let's look up at the top here. So we started off with one molecule of glucose, just one. It's 1 C6H12O6. Goes through glycolysis to produce 2 ATP. Goes to the Krebs cycle, these pyruvic acids, to produce 2 net ATP. Okay, so we have a total of 4 for every 1 molecule of glucose. Down here, electron transport chain happens. We produce 32 net ATP. So let's fill out this. For every 1 molecule of glucose, approximately how many AT molecules are produced? Add it together. 36. All right. You need ATP to grow, to reproduce and to develop. Your cell's ability to pump out the ATP is crucial to your survival. Where does it happen? In a cell. Specifically, most of the reactions happen within the mitochondria. Okay, so we know we need energy. 3 main sources of energy for us as autotrophs. We have ATP that's stored in our muscles. This kind of waiting for reserve to be used. We also have ATP made by something called lactic acid fermentation. Okay, talk more about that here in a little bit. We also have the ATP made from cellular respiration that I just got done talking about. Those 3 steps to produce that amount of ATP. Oops. Okay, so let's talk about lactic acid fermentation. So when doing strenuous activity, like studying for a biology test or running long distance, for example, that's 2 miles plus. You could even say 1 mile plus. Okay, not talking a little 100-yard dash here. The body actually, a term used is oxygen debt. The cells are lacking oxygen, okay, essentially during this time. But you still need to keep running, right? You've used up your reserve in your muscles, so you need to, and you don't have adequate supply of oxygen while you're running, okay? So your body kind of goes over to a different way to produce oxygen. And they still need the ATP. This is called lactic acid fermentation. When your cells are lacking oxygen, you've used up that reserve in your muscles, your body can switch to lactic acid fermentation instead of cellular respiration in times of need. So what happens is it takes those pyruvic acids, pyruvic acids. What did I mess up? Pyruvic, that's right. Acids, like over here. Instead of going into the Krebs cycle, it'll go into the lactic acid. It takes a different route. And it will produce lactic acid. Now, this lactic acid can then build up in your muscles. And you might have had that pain after long strenuous activities, kind of like burning in the muscles. That's caused by the buildup of the lactic acid. Eventually it will go away, but it will be there for a period of time. Other organisms, they don't have something called lactic acid fermentation. Like bacteria, for example, instead of lactic acid fermentation, it's called alcoholic fermentation. So those pyruvic acids, instead of being converted to lactic acid, they're converted to alcohol. And this process is used, of course, to make beer and wine and things like that. Lastly, this is something I want you to fill out on your own. I'm not going to go over the answers per se, but a good review here. We've talked about different organisms and their ability and what they can do. Okay, undo. Okay. Plants, animal cells. All right. So which organisms are capable of photosynthesis? Write them down. When I say photosynthesis, what kind of organisms can actually undergo that chemical reaction or the series of chemical reactions in their cells? Write a few ideas down. And then cellular respiration. We just got done talking about this chapter 9. What cells or what organisms can undergo cellular respiration? Taking the glucose to produce the ATP. Jot a few ideas down. That's the end of chapter 9.